meat of today's presentation. So this is part of a series of talks we'll be running through June and July called Long Views of London. I'm rather fond of a pun or a double meaning, and I thought I'd include one in the title of this series. So a long view is both a particular sort of form of art, and we can see a particularly fine example on the screen in front of us. It's a panorama which shows, a cityscape or a wide view across a broad perspective, but it's also the sense that we're going to be looking at London history from some distance. And by looking at London history from some distance and starting in the 1500s, we can see some remarkable changes into the geography and the topography of the city, the demographics, but also its kind of cultural, commercial and religious life. By a happy coincidence, the art form of the long view starts to become popular and more widespread in the middle of the 1500s, and that's also when, if we were to take a long view of history, we can chart a very significant rise both in the significance on a kind of a global stage of London and Britain. In some sense, it's the birth of the British Empire, and we'll see all manner of changes coming to London, fitting as a result of it being the capital of this empire. And I'm now going to switch to the presentation. I'm afraid I've not quite mastered the software yet to be able to do two things at once. So if you could just bear with me one moment whilst I change my view, and then we will make a start. So you should all now be able to see the view of this view of London with a little red pointer, as well. And this, in doing so, this takes us to London in 1543, and this is a work by the Dutch artist Anton van der Vengaard. And if we take a moment to just absorb what we're seeing here, there'll be perhaps some familiar shape, some sort of familiar idea, but it does look very different, very markedly different from the London of today, because the London of this time was obviously a much smaller place. You could comfortably walk it in a day. It's has a population of around 100,000. It's a smaller, more comfortable, a smaller place, but it's nonetheless a very fierce and vibrant capital city, the sixth largest city in London. As we cast our eye over this long view, a few features will start to come into focus. We will see, no doubt, the Church of St Mary Overy, the present day site of Southwark Cathedral. We'll see London Bridge. Of course, see the River Thames running through. The taller ships on one side of the Thames and smaller rowing boats on the other. We see the spire of the Gothic incarnation of St Paul's Cathedral. Out to the west, we might be struck by the amount of fields and greenery, but we can make out Westminster Abbey. We can make out Westminster Abbey here. If we were to take one of these boats back across the river, we can see Lambeth as a site of fields. We can see the Borough High Street as we head east. Perhaps crossing back over London Bridge, you'll see the familiar form of the Tower of London. Slightly different, perhaps. This iteration has a cupola rather than towers, but we see recognisably nonetheless the Tower of London. But one of the views that really stands out is this collection of buildings on the right hand side here, and this is Bermondsey Abbey. And Bermondsey Abbey, it was an important abbey at this time, but it's also very notable that when this map was made, this panorama was made, 1543. We were only a couple of years after the dissolution of the monastery. So Bermondsey Abbey was first passed into sort of state hands, into crown hands, and then was passed to various sort of friends and allies of the crown. And this is the dissolution of the monasteries is a seminal moment in London history, and more broadly, of course, in British history as well. It represents one of the largest transfers of land and wealth in our history, and it also is a very important departure from the medieval period. We're seeing in the medieval period, we can see a series of battles between the power of church and state. Just think of Thomas of Becket and that turbulent priest. The crown and the church try and vie for both sort of spiritual power, but also very much of power on the ground. And what we see with the dissolution of monasteries is really the crown winning that battle. It takes power, it puts into private hands, and in a very real sense that wealth will be allowed to sort of fuel the mercantile, the trading expansion of London in the coming centuries. And so it's worth really sort of stressing that the significance of this. The monasteries were important. The monasteries and the abbeys were an important part of medieval life, and this is why Vengard has spent quite a lot of time and detailing this image, as well as showing the significance of the monasteries. This imagery we have now also is an example of Vengard's skill as an artist, and in particular a draftsman. So this panorama would have been engraved on metal plates and reproduced that way. But first, of course, it would have been drawn, and we can see the quality of the line work very much in this. It's sort of a very sensitive style. In particular, the detailing on the windows here, which creates a sort of a sense of space in the main cloister there. The skip, and one of both the charms and the limitations, of course, of this art form is that it's all grayscale. Color can't be used unless it's added separately later in the form of a wash. And so one of the skills of an artist is to use different values, different sort of darknesses of grey, and we can see this to create shading and kind of depth. You can see how this is done on the roof and on the windows here, but because so much of the artwork from this period is black and white or grayscale, we tend to forget, we tend to fall into that trap perhaps of seeing the past in black and white, and we perhaps shouldn't do that because there was much colour and celebration here. And we also should remember that today perhaps we think of monasteries as slightly rarefied spiritual places of retreat and solace, but in their day they were very much part of the bustle of politics. They were wealthy, they were powerful, and they were not above a bit of court intrigue. And Bermondsey Abbey was where Elizabeth Woodville, the former consort of Edward IV, spent her final years. And we can see that sort of interplay between political and religious life very, very closely in the image we can see on the left-hand side. This is an image from the Skinners Company, from their fraternity book. And Elizabeth Woodville was a patron and a member of that fraternity. And we can see that there are it's an illuminated manuscript, and it's very much drawing on religious iconography. So Elizabeth Woodville is being portrayed as the Virgin Mary. We can see the long flowing blonde hair, and obviously most obviously the blue cloak here. This is both to portray her as a noble queen and virtuous mother, important things for a queen, but it's also perhaps to draw some distraction away from her past. So she was, for those of you who are not sort of versed in the Wars of the Roses, Elizabeth Woodville was a scandalous marriage, was a scandalous marriage, and that married the King Edward in secret. She was previously married with her own children, not thought to be fitting things for a queen of that day. So we can see the distraction being used there by presenting her in this Marian form. But court politics, of course, came more seriously during the dissolution of the monasteries. This is a document not from the collections of London Metropolitan Archives, but from the National Archives over in Kew from 1535, called Valla Ecclesiastorum. You can see Henry VIII there, proudly sitting on the throne, like something straight out of a Hans Holbein portrait in the V there. And the Valla Ecclesiastorum was a valuation of monastic lands and properties, and Bermondsey Abbey, amongst others, was included this, and the extent of its lands were quite significant, with an annual income of £450 a year. So an important, very important player in the kind of the wealth and politics of its time. Another foray into colour. This is a map. It's a map of London that appeared in the latter part of the 1500s, published in Holland, but it's actually from an earlier image. So this is one of the oldest map views we have of London, and it's a derivative of the so-called copperplate map. The copperplate map most likely depicts London as it appeared in around the 1550s, but it's a map that's mostly lost to us. Only a few images have survived, and these are on the back of other paintings. So effectively, the copper plates, these are the plates that the image is engraved into before reproductions, before impressions are made. The copper backing plates were reused as canvases to for other later artworks, only discovered in the latter part of the 20th century. There are 2 of these copper plates in the collection of the Museum of London, and another in a museum in Germany. And when we see this map, we might pay some attention to the view. So this is not the sort of the map view that we're perhaps most used to, which is the plan view, as in the view being looked directly overhead. Instead, this is a sort of a bird's eye view. It's a bird's eye view of London, and what this bird's eye view of London allows is a sense of the topography, a sense of the streets. We can see the street plan here, quite nicely delineated. The main road in from the north. We get a sense of the wall, the London Wall, running along here. We get the Smithfield along here. It gives us a place to locate things, but it does also allow for an exploration of the topography of London as well, of particular buildings. So, for example, the Tower of London can be seen here in something approaching three dimensions. It's seen in some senses through the best of both worlds in that regard. As I said, the copperplate map is mostly lost to us, but what we do have instead is this map that's often referred to as the Aggas map or the woodcut map, which is a derivative, slightly less detailed version of the copperplate map. It's called, you'll often hear it called the Aggas map, because it was earlier scholarship effectively wrongly attributed it to Ralph Aggas, who was a 17th century antiquarian and historian. It's properly called, or certainly described in our collection, but not as the Aggas map, but as a Civitas Londinium that you can see there. And this is one of those maps that really does, very charming map. It really does reward close examination and study. And what I'd like to do is point out a few features of this map that obviously wouldn't be clear on such a zoomed out perspective. And then and of course, as I mentioned, I will provide links where you can zoom in and really, spend some time on your own exploring and enjoying this map. The first thing to say is that although the map was originally surveyed around the 1560s, no copies survive from that time. The copies that we have are from later impressions, a little under a century later, from Jacobean times. The maps the two versions are largely the same, but you do see a few later insertions where sections of wood will have been cut out and new printing blocks literally inserted. The most prominent is that the Tudor arms have been replaced by the arms of King James, which you can see at the top left-hand side of the map. There are a few other details that don't really show up that well on this resolution. If you have spend a bit of time examining the exact forms of the ships along the river, you can actually see that the royal barge, the royal barge's arms have been included, but they don't match. So you have the Tudor arms on the boat and the Jacobean arms on the top left-hand side. And if you're mathematically minded, you can read through the descriptions on either side, which is to eulogies to London and evocations of a mythical past. You can see as well, you can date it from that as well. One of the interesting approaches taken by the map maker, Ralph Agus or otherwise, is that there's an interesting combination of reproduction of kind of uniform shapes, but also some examination and delineation of particular forms as well. That's particularly evident in the churches that are included in the map. So here we can see 3 churches: St Dunstan in the west, Temple Church, and St Dunstan in the east. And we will see that they all have been, although they're surrounded by somewhat uniform houses, the churches themselves have been rendered individually. So we can see a square tower in St Dunstan in the west. The temple, the famous Temple Church, we can see its rounded form there. And then in the east, we can see the spire of St Dunstan in the east. And again, that's just the risk of repeating myself. That is one of the particular charms of this format. It allows both street plan but unique features to be put on that as well. Another particularly engaging feature of this map is that it's taken some time. To depict London, the people of London as well. So here we can see Spitalfield. This is the Spitalfield, and we can see the people of London engaging in leisure activity, as well as seeing we can see cows grazing in the fields as well. We see a few people practicing their musketry along here. We can see the musket and a puff of gunpowder. But more common is are people practicing their archery. We can see the archers here. You can see archers here. And this would have been a popular and even indeed legally compelled pastime, the practice of archery. What they'd be doing is they'd be shooting marks. So to shoot marks, you go out with your friends. You'd wander around a field. In this case, it's Spitalfield. Someone would pick a target. Someone would fire the arrow at a particular target, and then it was the job of the rest of the party to try and hit that mark as closely as possible. You can imagine perhaps it's something as a cross between golf and bulls. But as we will see in sort of various episodes throughout our visit to London in the 1500s, they have a different take on safety and danger and perhaps violence more generally, because you will see, as well as people practicing archery, you will see people taking a more general stroll. And accidents were not unknown. Indeed, in Islington there is a charity and an almshouse, the Dame Owen Almshouse and Charity, and Dame Owen was spurred to start the charity foundation after having a near miss. She was out strolling in the fields of Islington when an arrow went through her hat. Obviously, a little lower, it would have been fatal. She took this as an act of providence and decided to dedicate herself to more charitable causes for the rest of her life. There are other interesting features of people included in this map as well. So this is Moorfields, and we can see people hanging out clothes and fabric and cloth. And we can also see the various wharves, the warehouse, the riverside facilities, and the bristling docks, all detailed as well. And this is important because it shows us what's being included isn't entirely accidental. This map is not designed simply to record London. It's designed as also to present London in a certain way, and it's designed to present London as a thriving merchant city. And with our archers and with our muskets, it's showing a military powerful city as well. A theme we can come back to again and again in map making is the interesting balance and interplay between the subjective and the objective rigor of projections and measurements and surveying, and the artistic and almost editorial choices that are also included by the map makers. We can be fooled by maps into thinking that they're objective. They have objective means, but they're always trying to present something. And that's strikingly clear with this this close-up view of the city. You may notice this section here looks a little different from the rest. It's the hatching is slightly different. It's a slightly different colour. Well, this is a later insertion, and this is the Royal Exchange, which opened after this map was surveyed. The Royal Exchange was the work of Sir Thomas Gresham, and it's a very important milestone in London's sort of commercial and economic history. So, modelled after the Bourse, or the trading floor in Antwerp, Thomas Gresham was Thomas Gresham was keen that London would have a place where its merchants could come together and trade. Such places did already exist, but they tended to be on the streets. So Lombard Street was a famous place of trading, but obviously it was subject to the vagaries of the wind and the rain and the English weather, and it was indeed much colder then than it is now. Or some trading would also take place around St Paul's Cathedral, but there wasn't a single enclosed space. And the Royal Exchange was a place for merchants to come and trade. But it was more than that. We get a sense of that it's on several floors in this image, and the second and third floors were dedicated to shopping, and merchants and vendors could rent fairly small kind of sections of this and have an inside place to trade their wares. And also it meant that its upper class patrons could trade in more comfort and privacy as well. So perhaps slightly flippantly, the Royal Exchange is sometimes described as the world's first shopping mall, the world's first shopping centre as well. But what that does show us is this kind of the importance of trade and the kind of commercial endeavour of London. The fact that it's the Royal Exchange, it was endorsed by Queen Elizabeth, shows the power of trade. This is a time when British merchants and adventurers and colonisers are going out across the world, and military and merchant power are very, very much linked at this stage. So the Royal Exchange was seen as important enough to seem to be inserted into the map. But of course, some more familiar landmarks were included as well. And this is obviously the Tower of London, the east side of the map, and this is Tower Green and Tower Hill. And we can see on the upper left of this map, you may be able to make out the gallows here. Tower Hill was obviously a famous site of execution. Traitors were executed, hung, drawn, and quartered, or sometimes beheaded as well, or often beheaded as well on Tower Hill. There was a sort of a perverse distinction to reaching your fate, your end on Tower Hill. It was reserved to people who were thought to be the biggest sort of threat to the crown. If you were seen as a sort of a lower status criminal, you might be hung at Tyburn or various other locations. But to meet your end at Tower Hill was seen as something of a mark of distinction in some quarters, and we now have a view of London Bridge. And after you met your end at Tower Hill, your head may well end up on a spike on London Bridge. And we know that some people found some distinction in having the relative's head displayed, because if you're aristocratic, you might boast as you walked across the bridge, you might boast to one of your to your acquaintances that your ancestor was so important, he was such a threat to the throne, that they felt need to dispatch him and display him here. And the display is, of course, a warning. This is a time when there isn't a police force, anything like the modern sense. It's very hard to know what people are up to. It's very hard for the crown to sort of defend itself. And so what we see is really quite, to a modern eye, really quite extreme examples of violence to serve as a deterrent to those people that they can catch. This image. Heads and all, is from around about 1616, and this is the Vischer panorama, and we can see the entire panorama on our screen now. And the Vischer panorama is another of our long views, and the characteristic form of these long views, as we mentioned, is this bird's eye view from a kind of an imagined floating point a little bit slightly above ground level. And this is a very popular view of London. We saw it first in 1543, but it's something that remains with us in one form or another, really to the present day. And that's because there's a nice synergy between the demands of the long view and the artistic form that it allows. You want a kind of a low raking view, which gives this very broad perspective. So riverfront is an ideal subject, and the fact that for practical reasons, so much of London's wealth in its early modern and medieval period was concentrated along the river and remains to that day. So we have an interesting mix between the form and the subject. If you want to show London in its splendour, you show the river. If you want to show river in its splendour, you use a long view. And as we heard, this is a fairly kind of grisly London, perhaps, compared to the London of today. We have heads on spikes. And I think if we were visiting London today, we might be a bit shocked by that. So we might wander down the South Bank, perhaps wanting some entertainment and some diversion. Perhaps we'd go to the theatre. But if we were doing that, looking for a bit of respite, we might be slightly shocked, because although we think today of the South Bank as a place of theatre, one of the more popular forms of entertainment at this time was bull baiting or bear baiting, animal baiting. This was a very popular pastime. All sections of society would spend their would visit. You could have about 1,000 people in one of these arenas on various tiered seating. Where you were in society would reflect where you sat. And whereas today it's seen as sort of quite a cruel pastime, it was seen as we have contemporary describing as a sweet and noble pastime. The idea with animal baiting wasn't that it was that a dog, often an English Mastiff, would fight an animal. The idea was that the dog would bait, would wind up, would antagonise the animal, and then it would be rescued from trouble by its owner with long poles. Not only was bear baiting and animal baiting popular, it was encouraged and even lawfully required. So it was thought that bulls that had been first baited were better quality meat, and they tasted better, and a butcher could actually be fined for selling unbaited meat. Not every London would be able to afford meat, unbaited or otherwise. Meat was very much the purview of the wealthy, and other Londoners would have to make do with more humble fare. And in this close-up view of the Bishop on the Bishop panorama, you may be able to make out the eel ships. The old-fashioned spelling, eel ships. You can see a load of eels being hauled into the ship here, and eels were a plentiful source of food in this period. They bred and swam freely in the River Thames. You'd have native eel ships, but also Dutch eel traders would come bringing 6,000 pounds, taking 6,000 pounds of eels home with them at a time, keeping them alive in tanks in their holds. These Dutch traders may buy these wholesale at somewhere like Billingsgate Fish Market, but other Londoners might actually row small boats and buy directly from the eel ships moored in the River Thames. And although it was mostly kind of the fare of the common man, during religious holidays, times of religious observance, when eating of meat was prohibited, you would see eels on the table of the wealthy as well. Interestingly, Vischer most likely never visited London, although the Vischer panorama is seen as one of the most accomplished of the long views of London. He never visited, and instead his artwork was created by he was a compilation of sketches and maps drawn by other artists. And of course, that is a process that you often see, but often by the same artist. And on the screen here we have a couple of images that kind of continue that theme. So these are both by Claude de Jong, one of the Dutch masters. Sometimes slightly sort of dismissively called one of the lesser Dutch masters. I think we could just call him one of the Dutch masters. We can see the preparatory sketches, the sketches on the top, which are in the collection of the Guildhall Library, they're part of the City of London collections, and at the bottom we see one of the finished product. This particular image coming from the Yale Centre for British Art, and it's worth spending a bit of time just taking this image to consider this question of accuracy and what artists were trying to achieve. So I think to a modern eye, when we see pictures of old London, when we see views of London, we're very concerned with how accurate they are. I certainly myself want to know, is that what London really looked like? Is that what the London of our forebears really looked like? And such questions were probably less important to the people at the time. They knew what London looked like. They were interested in striking images. It had to have some resemblance to reality, but they were sometimes more concerned with artistic or effect. And that's evident in these images here. This is, of course, London Bridge. And we can see an incredibly detailed painting of London Bridge, the various textures on the housing, the contrast, the varied shades, and of the brickwork on the houses and the bridge itself. Careful, very nice use of line work to give the sense of height. All those things, the reflection in the water, the time and attention and the skill lavished in this may fool us into thinking this is what it looked like. It did not look like this, but we know from contemporary accounts that the arches of London Bridge were pointed rather than round, and that they were irregular. Not all arches were the same size. And here we see rounded arches and regular arches as well. So in actual fact, the arches of the bridge may look something a bit more like this. This is a later image, 1795. So it's post the Great Fire, but the bridge would have largely survived, and we can see more clearly the variation in the arches there. So sometimes these works from the past, as charming and insightful as they are, they can lead us astray. We can't let their charm dull our critical faculties too much. So we know Fisher most likely never visited London, but the same cannot be said for the artist whose work we see on the screen now. This is the work of Evangelist Holler, a Bohemian artist who came to London under the patronage of Lord Arundel, the 21st Lord of Arundel, who was an art collector in his own right. Holler is probably most famous for his own long view. You can see the Holler panorama on the bottom. It's roughly contemporary with the Fisher panorama, published in 1647, but some of the details of the Holler panorama lead us to believe that it was probably first published. It was probably drawn and surveyed a little earlier than that, and also it would have been added later. The impression that we have in our collection actually comes a little later, and you can see, actually, if I go back, you can see in the Fisher panorama, 1616, St Paul's Cathedral has lost its spire, came down in a fire, other than the Great Fire. But in Holler's panorama, we have the spire is back, but in different rounded form. So again, that question of verisimilitude comes up again. The skill and the craft and attention to detail of the work is unmistakable, but they have a slightly different agenda perhaps than our kind of archival agenda of what did London really look like. Holler was a prolific worker. He stayed in London for most of his life after coming here under the patronage of the Lord of Arundel, leaving briefly during the period of the Civil War. As well as his long views, there are other views of London. We see depictions of London's people on here, the interior of buildings as well. This is the interior of St Paul's, and he also got slightly further afield than some of the other long view artists. So this you might be able to make out as Windsor. This is Windsor Castle. We also see panoramas from Albury and Surrey as well. So an extensive and prolific worker. But unfortunately, the career of Holler reflects a sad fact for early kind of photographers and artists, that it was very hard work, often poorly paid work. Despite a tremendous output, Holler died in poverty. Indeed, we hear amongst his last words a kind of a rather plaintive plea to his bailiffs that they might wait until he died before they take his bed away. The question of accuracy and what's represented and what's put in is and the kind of the purpose of a map is begged even more by the last map, the last sort of set images we're going to look at as part of the full presentation. This is an exact delineation of the cities of London and Westminster and the suburbs there together, and so on. So this is the New Court and Fairthorne map, and like our previous map, it has the bird's eye view, combining an accurate street plan with some description of individual buildings as well. And you can see that included on this image are St Peter's Westminster, so Westminster Abbey, and St Paul's Cathedral without its spire once again. Now, don't worry if you're seeing a rather distorted and wiggly map. There isn't a problem with your screen, nor are you hallucinating. This particular image of the map is taken from a website called Layers of London. Layers of London is a collaboration between many cultural institutions to make historical maps available online and in a kind of comparative form. And the way the maps are, before these maps have been put on Layers of London, they've been what's called a geo-rectified. So geo-rectification is a process whereby you correct for the inaccuracies, the limitations of earlier surveying methods. You basically work with a modern satellite derived map. You overlay the historical map. You find control points. You morph the two on the other, and you get this, and the inaccuracies in the map are kind of revealed by this distortion. If you imagine your map was on a rubber, you have your map on a rubber sheet, and you're kind of pinning locations to the real location, they're going to be distorted and pulled out. And that's what we can see here. So in the standalone version of this map, these lines would be straight, but here we can see that they are distorted. Not accurate to modern standards, but fairly accurate to the standards of its day. And we can perhaps forgive the challenges of surveying with chain and theodolite. It's hard to do that in a city of low-lying buildings. It's hard to find high points, and also swampy land to the west would have made accurate measurement difficult as well. But to a modern eye that's keen on accuracy, we'd be perhaps a bit more concerned about some of the features that have been omitted. This map was likely surveyed between 1643 and 1647, so during the English Civil War. We can tell that we can deduce that because of the existence of that it features the Charing Cross, these two crosses, so the Charing Cross and the Cheapside Cross. One, I'm afraid I had a bit of a bug and I can't see my notes. So one was built in one was extended in 1643, the other was destroyed in 1647. I'm afraid due to this little bug I can't see my notes properly. So I'm afraid I can't tell you which one, but basically it gives us a bookmark, the inclusion of the Charing Cross and the exclusion of the Cheapside Cross tells us that it was surveyed during those times. If we go back, this tells us that some important features would have been omitted, because if it's surveyed between 1643 and 1647 during the Civil War, indeed it might have been that the Civil War was the reason for the survey in the first place. We would expect some fortifications, particularly out to the west, and these fortifications survived after the Civil War, when the map was published in 1665, and they're manifestly not here. There are no fortifications to the west of this map, and this would have been a familiar everyday feature of London. And again, it's this idea of the map maker is accurate depictions of streets, of buildings, but they're choosing what to include and what not to include. There's some judgment being made about how London in the past is being displayed. But with those kind of caveats in mind, this map does give us some interesting senses of what's going on, of how London is changing. So this is an area to the west. This would be modern day Covent Garden, and we can see that London is spilling out from the city of London and the city of Westminster, which would be here, which would have been previously, and indeed at the time of this map, seen as very much separate entities, are kind of starting to merge together. The piazza was designed by Inigo Jones of Covent Garden, and as part of that, the streets around were remodeled, and that's because in addition to London, one of the reasons that London was able to grow at this time is because carriages were becoming ever more popular. The invention of a new type of carriage in the second half of the 16th century allowed the wealthy to travel sort of far and wider. The suburbs of London, Greenwich at the time, would now be kind of only a day's ride away, and you didn't need to be so close, but you also needed more room for your horses. So we see Somerset House and the other York House, the other Savoy. We see other noble houses being remodeled at this point to allow more stabling, more space for horses. We also get a sense of the relaxation following the Civil War. Included, we can see a gaming house on the edge of this map here, so a gambling house. Gaming and other pastimes would of course been were banned during the interregnum, the period following the Civil War, and so we do get a sense of the restoration and that kind of celebration of vice as well as virtue taking place here. We can also see on this map expansion out to the east as well. So these are this is the tower here. We can see the main roads out to the east. Whitechapel will be out towards the Surrey. We can see the housing starting to fill in, which you wouldn't have seen on earlier maps. And again, once again, the river is shown as being full of ships and trading ships, again celebrating London's sort of merchant power. And that was very much the purpose of this map. If we go back to the first view of it, this was a map that would take up your whole wall. It was designed to be displayed on a map as well as being an object, and it was designed to display London at its best. We can see its landmarks, notable landmarks. This is a list of its churches. This is a list of the patrons. This is designed to be a lasting testament to the wealth of London in the year 1665. So it's of course with a sort of very sad, there's a sad and irony to this, that we tend to now see the Fairthorne map not as a statement of London as a powerful city, but really as the last gasp of the medieval city. So of course the Great Fire of London broke out in 1666, and with this fire nearly all of the medieval city of London was destroyed. And we will pick up the story, that story of the destruction of London and how it came to be rebuilt, and the way that cartographers and artists played their role in that in our next talk on the 23rd of June.